is the unfailing attachment to la grande récit, the great, or as it's more customarily said, the grand narrative of liberalism, as distinguished from liberalism as a docile situation, which can be said in the same breath as the technological essence. The account of the grand narrative is an account of something included and something left out in the sense, for instance, Dostoevsky gives it to one of his characters in Bezi, the Demons or the Possessed, which is about the rise of liberalism in late 19th century Tsarist Russia during the period when the czars are being hunted without a breath by the populations, and there's constant assassination attempts for I would say 50 years leading up to the finally the successful so-called Bolshevik Revolution, which is named after the very small proportion of the people that carried out that revolution who happened to be successful, perhaps due to a certain talent for treachery and legendarily for Lenin's ability to organize. Of course, the main bulk of the people were the so-called Soviet revolutionaries, who were really people that wanted rule by local town councils for motives that are perhaps dubitative, probably because this way the local farmers, who were the rich ones, could dominate the local scene and through the town councils rather than being subject to aristocratic rule from the czars, who were in a way alien to the vast bulk of the population, since they were French speaking and since they didn't really, in the same way that is given in Gross, a metaphor by I believe it's totally false, but the statement, "let them eat cake." So, I mean, of course, Marie Antoinette actually understood that there were people that were poor and couldn't afford cake, but nonetheless, by metaphor, we say that she said that, and it has a meaning to it. It's the same way you see it with the czars. This is a feeling of a desire to annihilate a certain factor and bring in something else. So there's a grand narrative around emancipation and around liberalism in this sense, and then you can ask, what did it leave out? And then if you read Carl Schmitt, you get the passionate version of it. If you read Leo Strauss, then you get a measured version of why. And so actually there is a good moment in the debate where we can see Adorno, Horkheimer have apparently repented after coming out with this social science survey about the so-called authoritarian personality versus the quote-unquote democratic personality, which for some reason after about 1930, and actually Samuel Moyn confirmed to me that this is only after about 1930 in American rhetoric did the word democracy take on a positive valence. Like before that, there was always the thought of a balanced regime, of separation of powers, not just in the way we understand it now, between Article 1, 2, and 3, but also in other ways, including trying to stop this cycle of the regimes as given by the ancients through the so-called mixed regime. So Now we regard a mixed regime as somehow a confounded regime, somehow something has been lost in the mixture that we don't like, and we want simply, again, a monarchism of one type of regime being the democratic regime. So originally, remember that the House of Representatives was known as the Democratic House, corresponding to the people who didn't understand what it meant to loll on their couches and roll in their carriages, as the Federalist Papers put it, Madison puts it. There had to be also the Senate in order to represent the people who actually almost all the founders belonged to this case, who were involved in a lot of business dealings and wouldn't be understood by the general population. Nonetheless, we shouldn't understand that. I'm not at all implying we should understand that cynically. It's rather that what the founders were thinking was still good in Lincoln's time, when Lincoln said in an address to the Agricultural Society of some state, I'm not sure which state, that under normal circumstances, every adult will find themselves eventually as a free homesteader. Like, so that this is the old meaning of why work was praised, because work would not mean salary, so that somebody else is deciding what you do and then you get a salary. What it would mean is homesteading, or something where your actual labor would go to yourself. So he said every normal case would eventually find their way to this free labor situation, and that was still at the time of the Civil War, or a little before the Civil War. That was still seemed to be a sensible case. So you had the people that were lolling on their couches and rolling in their carriages, but then you also had most people working on their own account as free men, or at least they could expect to rise to that station at some point in their life, except in the most extraordinary cases, similar to people that are today illiterate, where even though there's all kinds of possibilities to learn to read. So this is all part of a grand narrative which has shifted in its meaning through historical change. But then the question is, when we regard it, do we only regard it from inside, or do we accept the balanced argument as in Strauss and so on? This way of looking at the postmodern question actually is, I think, very straightforward. And so all it means is, in a certain way, at this level, it would just be a kind of exhortation to return to taking profoundly non-partial judgment, in the sense that Eric Voegelin or Leo Strauss poses themselves as being non-partial. Like, so, I mean, Voegelin, just to give an example of this sort of notion, is Voegelin had a copy of Mein Kampf, but he also had a copy of Das Kapital. He also had a copy of some books by the Fabian Society, this kind of George Bernard Shaw English version of Marxism. He had books by all kinds of people propounding on grand narratives, right? And an SS man came into his wife's house or apartment in Austria, which was about to leave in order to go to America, I think, and confiscated all the books, but he refused to take the copy of Mein Kampf. So Voegelin said, wouldn't it be fair, impartial, if you would, when you're making the report on me, you would report also that I'm reading Mein Kampf, so you give the whole truth of what I'm doing, instead of imputing him with the kind of aura of reading the enemy's books without saying that he's also reading the book for the SS man who's going to bring it back to his superiors to judge whether this man needs to be detained, could judge fairly. So there's some kind of standards which are accepted by people like Vogelin and Strauss, which they've taken out of Prussia, which what could see degenerated and went away, and after the Nazi Revolution, and probably already were in a kind of bacchanalia situation before that, during the so-called Weimar, because the Weimar meant that the French had imposed the grand narrative of the liberal constitution on the Prussians, who didn't want that. You could read, for instance, Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated during that period, writes, nobody in Prussia wanted this constitution. Everybody wanted to throw it off and get something that was more appropriate to the Prussian spirit. If you then take the question and apply it to the situation of Strauss and Vogelin and their standards, then you have a more extremely subtle issue, I believe, than the way we're talking about grand narratives when we only talk about explicit accounts like Locke, Mill, whatever, of what liberalism is. Read the Federalist Papers, read the Rights of Man and the Citizen, etc., etc., and then you know what it is, the explicit account. You get then to another level if you look at the whole situation, the behavior, the Sprachspiel, as it were, what's counted as reasonable, what's counted as not reasonable. And so there's inflections of this so-called postmodern version. It's actually sort of in the Hegelian sense of, first as tragedy, then as comedy. So you already had it with Hegel, who was the first to bring out the historical consciousness, so that he sees that everyone is kind of limited and has a certain selection of how they're thinking according to when they were born. So Aristotle has a philosophy of the slave, but then later on Hegel, living at the so-called end of history, has overcome that limited mentality, and even though he might not be constitutionally, by his character, a better man than Hegel, by virtue of living in a different time, he could see different things. That so-called historical awareness of this problem is kind of the tragedy, which at first Hegel tries to fix it by saying, oh, but we're already at the end and nothing essential is going to change from this point. And then we get this kind of comic version the more further we go, because it becomes aerstats, because the initial awareness has already seeped in. There's nothing more to do with it, but then you just keep talking about it. And then you have the postmodernism, which attempts to do what I talk about, the themes I just talked about, but it's already less basic. It's less like a law of nature than what we learned from the historical consciousness.